Thank you very much. Thank you, Siva. And welcome to probably the hardiest audience I've ever known for making it here on a night like this. I was halfway here and it started to snow and I was thinking, yeah. Anyway, and also can I welcome an incredibly cool piece of technology, which is this camera, which will be following me around and recording not only what I have to say through the lanyard, but also the pictures. So there is a downside that has a video of me. Just to introduce my background, I'm a senior business analyst with Visa Europe, specialising in clearing, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do in there. I started programming when I was 13, and somehow my secondary school had co-opted this all-transistor 1960s Elliott 803, which is anybody in the room probably doesn't. You do. Programmed with 5-hole paper tape. Which, when I was 13, I just thought that was the best toy a boy could ever possibly have, and somehow I made a career out of it. So that's where I'm starting from. Perhaps I ought to talk a little bit about what's Visa Europe. I work for the European part of Visa, and you're almost certainly familiar everywhere you go with these signs. Just after I started Visa, I had a personal trip to Paris, and then sort of walking to a cafe, thought, oh, hang on, I work for them, because they are absolutely everywhere. So who are we? Primarily, we're a technology business. Now, this is going to surprise people that think you're a bank, aren't you? No, we're not. We're actually primarily technology business. We're not a bank, and we don't issue cards. I have a corporate card for my day-to-day expenses when I'm traveling. It's not issued by Visa. It's actually got Visa Europe on it, which was embarrassing when it was once declined. happens to the best of us. It was a fraud system that got a little ahead of itself. But anyway, we provide the brand, rules, and systems to support payments. So when you see the Visa symbol, Visa logo, there is a whole organisation behind it, making it work, making things happen. We are also, in Europe, wholly controlled and owned by the banks. We are sort of the co-op. I did talk about us as being like the co-op. We're owned by our customers, or not so much John Lewis owned by their employees, but we're owned by our customers and run by them. That produces some very interesting challenges when it comes to technology and governance and how you build projects. And in Europe, €1 in every €6.75, which is a slightly odd number, that's just gone up last year, that was in this year's annual report, is spent using a Visa card. So we are an absolutely key part of payments in Europe. In fact, that figure is £1 in every 3 in Britain spent by consumers is made using a Visa card. And we'll talk more about what that means as an IT professional later on. But Visa Europe isn't just about consumers. I'm guessing you've all got cards in your pocket, or most people have got cards in their pockets. But we also support electronic payments for businesses and governments. I've already talked about the corporate card that I have for my expenses, but there are also cards for making smaller purchases, and also UK government has a thing called the government purchasing card, which is used to make smaller payments and invoices. So we're not just about consumers, we're about businesses large and small, and governments as well. So that makes us quite big. So what do we do? We have buildings full of engineers, scientists and technologists. What on earth do we do with ourselves? We provide a series of technical platforms to do certain major jobs. We authorize, and I'll talk about all these in a moment. We authenticate, who are you? Clear and settle. And we also look at data. We do analytics on data for various reasons. So let me talk about what we do. Authorization is about, is the transaction safe? Now, those of a certain age, and I think I've only ever had this happen to me once, the shopkeeper actually rang the bank. You may remember that. They would take your card and they go, "Oh, sorry, sir, I've got to ring the bank." And they actually phone up. That doesn't happen anymore. At least I haven't seen it in recent times. We do all this online. The POS terminal, which came in 20 years ago, revolutionised how we accept cards. Here was something, swipe a card or dip it, contacts the bank, and it all happens in a few seconds. So we ask, is the transaction safe? Is the money in place to cover the transaction, which is always the important thing. So getting declined doesn't necessarily mean that there's no money. It could be just that something somewhere has decided the transaction's not safe. So how do we do that? We send the transaction to the card issuer. Every card that you have is issued by a bank somewhere. And we send a message on to an issuer to say, this is the transaction, do you like it? But in the process, we've already looked at the transaction and said, is it risky? Do we think this is a risk? For example, a card that's used almost exclusively around the UK suddenly pops up in India or China or somewhere completely unexpected. There's a risk there. Do we want to check it? A card that's perhaps used almost exclusively for the shopping suddenly spends £2,000 on sporting goods in Alaska. It's out of character. So we can perform real-time fraud scoring. We have models which tell us and rules which tell us when a card is being used in an unexpected way. And that's not to say it's not legitimate, but at least it can alert the cardholder that something's wrong. For example, I was in the US last week on business. I used my own card to buy one or two bits and pieces, and my mobile phone starts beeping at me that my bank's detected I'm in America and I hadn't told them. Right. Was that okay? And yes, it was. It was just an alert. Something we also do is stand in for banks when they're not available. I'll talk a lot about availability later because it's very important to Visa. But what we do, but banks need to take their systems down to do routine maintenance. I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience about taking things down once in a while just to sort it out and give it a restart. And we stand in for members when they're doing that, or when they've had any kind of problem. It's not unknown for road menders to put road diggers through fibre optics. It happens. It happens quite a lot. It's amazing. It's quite often for member systems to think it's 2 a.m. We'll run a batch job on the database to give it a tidy up and clean up, and suddenly it stops working. In that case, Visa can stand in. We can look after the members and prevent that sinking moment where the terminal just can't. Well, we prevent the possibility that a card can't be authorised or approved in some way. So what does authorisation have to be? Now, who would like it if every time a card was authorised it took 30 seconds or a minute? No? Good. Okay. It certainly used to. Well, our services, we have a transit time across our authorisations which typically of around, 200 milliseconds for this audience, a fifth of a second for the kind of marketing audience I occasionally talk to. It's a blink of an eye, which is how I talk to people in PR. It's that fast. We have to go very quickly. And in that time we've passed the message, checked the card isn't lost or stolen, given it a fraud score, rebuilt the message and sent it out. And it's typically about 200 milliseconds from side to side. These days, we expect the issuing banks to respond to us in 5 seconds. If they don't, we assume that they've broken down. And if broken down, there's a problem. Road digger through the fibre optic again, and we stand in for them. And we do all of that in real time. In real time. we have to be available. We can't go offline. And when I say can't go offline, I don't mean, well, I'll talk a little bit about more statistics and so on later on. But we have to be 100% available and have been since May 2007. And when I mean that's no scheduled outage either. That's on. How we do that, I'll talk a little bit more about later. But it's extremely important to us. That's actually on our corporate scorecard. If we miss that, we're in trouble. Yeah. And everything's monitored and controlled. We have to, again, our operations live 24/7, monitoring what's going on. For example, suddenly are we not seeing responses from a member? Then we get in touch. What's gone wrong? Have you crashed? Have you crashed? Something gone wrong? It's not unknown, incidentally, that we tell members they've got a problem before they realise it themselves. It's quite dramatic. Indeed. We're also monitoring our own performance, monitoring our own systems, and we can take corrective action. So in the summary in the key steps, and this is probably the slide with the most text on it this evening, but you'll be glad to know. We send the transaction to the acquirer. The merchant sends the transaction. They format and send it to us. We have a particular format of message. It's actually an ISO standard. It's 8583. If you want to look it up in a spare moment, and they send it, and that's how they send it to us. We check if it's blocked, lost, or stolen. This is, and again, your issuer can block a card should be able to block a card in a matter of a couple of minutes. If you ring in and say my card's been stolen, it should be dead in a couple of minutes. That depends on your issuing bank and how hooked up they are, but it should be a couple of minutes. We apply a risk score, and we then send it to the issuer, your card issuer, for approval. We don't, if the issuer is available, we don't approve anything. That's always belongs to the issuer. We only approve if the issuer is not available, or occasionally if they're so busy, such as at Christmas, that their response times have fallen so much that we step in and help out. And we then send the issue response back, which is nowadays approve or decline. Again, years ago there was this thing called refer, which is where the shop's bank would actually ring you up and ask you questions. Some years ago, and it wasn't a Visa card, it was a now defunct debit card brand in the UK. We bought a car, and all of a sudden our bank decided spending £13,000 in one transaction was a bit much. We wanted to know what we were doing. It was legitimate, but they just wanted to check. We do authentication. Authentication answers the question, who are you? Now there's a great cartoon, which I can't use, from the New Yorker, which is a dog sat at a computer talking to another dog, saying, it's great, on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. That's perfect, because of course, how does your bank know when you go to do a transaction that actually you're the person who should be holding the card? We can do a couple of things. If you're doing an online transaction, we'll do address validation. Your bank knows where you live, you know where you live, you can tell them. And that's sort of helpful. That works, that's a good start. If you're doing a transaction at a terminal, you've got a PIN, or a cash machine, you've got your PIN. And again, we record the PIN, we can check your PIN, and we know who you are. We can also check the data held on a card. Now this is not going to come across very well on the video, so I'm also just going to cover up some of the details. But these 3 digits on the end, the ones that they say are on the back of the stripe, which I'll just put this back now because it is actually my card, not worked. We call that in Visa CVV2, which is a number which is only printed on the card. So sometimes you'll be asked for the security code or such and such. There's usually some help button to show you helpfully where it is on cards. that's only held, that's printed on the card, and it's nowhere else. So when you go to authorise, card goes to authorise, your bank can check you out and say, yes, they've got the number right. Fantastic, that must be them. Also, you can ask the cardholder directly. Verified by Visa, which I have the logo for handily up here. This is where you're usually on a website, and you'll get some message from the website saying your bank wants to talk to you. So knock 2 times for yes, and up pops this magical window. That's verified by Visa, and that's actually connecting your web page back to your bank for it to ask you questions. And usually it asks you to put in the 3 characters from whatever password you thought was a good idea at the time when you set it verified by Visa. But it works. It works very well. It is very secure because not only can the issuer say, yes, you are who you are, but when the authorization message comes all the way through from the merchant, all the way through the approval chain, back to the bank, it can say, yes, not only was it that, but it was that approval that I gave, and it links it together. So verified by Visa, it's not always the most obvious or popular approval things. I do know people whose hearts sink when they get a verified by Visa window. I urge you to persevere because it is very secure. That is an exceptionally secure way of authenticating yourself. Now, authentication, it needs to be reliable. Interestingly enough, you can't have an authentication means which you do something today and it works, and you do something tomorrow, the same thing again tomorrow, and it doesn't work. It mustn't be too onerous. Now, some people will think verified by Visa is too onerous. Back in the very dim and distant past, in the internet terms, that's about 2001, there was a thing called the Secure Electronic Transaction. And it was so secure, it was wonderful. Absolutely rock hard security. In fact, it was so secure that nobody could use it. And that's a lesson for us all. It was too onerous, it was too difficult for people to use. And as a result, it just withered on the vine. It was never used, never really used. It needs to be reasonably foolproof. Nothing is absolutely foolproof. Verified by Visa is pretty close. Nothing's absolutely foolproof. There's always the human element. I think people should be locked up for writing the PIN on the back of a card. But you see it all the time. And if you really can't remember a number, your bank can give you a chip card that's signature as well. So if you've got somebody with an actual number blindness, and I know somebody with this condition, they have a chip and signature card. You have to go and ask for that, though, very, very nicely. Not all banks actually realise they can do that. So authentication, it's reliable, it's about reliability, not too onerous, and reasonably foolproof. So, we're in a good state now. We know who you are, the money's there, and the transaction's gone through. And the marvellous add-on device for the iPhone is yours. And it's on its way in the post or in the shop. The transaction's done. Marvellous. No money's moved yet. And this is the function of clearing. Clearing is interesting because in a way it's quite old-fashioned. Clearing you could trace back to when cheques started to come into use back in the 19th century. It was you gave your merchant a cheque and it had to make its way through all the different places until it got to your bank to be paid, and then the money moved. And again, I found when I was preparing these slides, I found a lovely graphic of the Central Cheque Clearing House from 1947. And it was long rows of desks with adding machines and ledgers, and that's just what we do inside our system, albeit inside an IBM AIX server rather than an office in the city. But we collect transactions, from shops and from all the acquiring banks, and we forward them on to the issuing banks. So we collect the transactions. On a busy day, we can collect 35 or 40 million transactions a day. And we also validate them. We don't just send any old rubbish on to our members. We validate them. For example, we'll check that inside our transactions, we know, was it a cash machine transaction, was it a POS transaction? So we can say it's a cash machine transaction, we expect to see these fields, and yes, they're there, and we forward it on. We've validated it, we've checked it out. We sort transactions for delivery. Issuers won't know about a transaction in clearing until they actually get a file. Again, and so we do that. And finally, we deliver transactions to members. Now, the clearing message is possibly the oldest part of Visa. And I remember 10 years ago when I was being trained on clearing and settlement, I took one look at how this thing was laid out and thought, COBOL. Because it is 168 characters long, and positions 1 and 2 tell you what kind of transaction it is. Positions 3 and 4 do something else. 5 to 10 do something else. 11 to so on, all the way to 168. So if you remember COBOL, or still doing it perhaps, it's that model. We have that. It's a flat file. It's a very strictly formatted flat file, in which we space and zero fill to get to the right length. And that seems terribly anomalous these days. But we'll talk about change later on, but actually moving off that is going to be the work of Hercules. Truly it is. So what must clearing be? Must be, again, consistency. We talked about consistency of authentication. Talked about consistency of authorization. Does it do the same thing every time? Yes, it has to. So no matter which member it is, they send us a transaction, we deal with it correctly. Obviously, it must be accurate. We can't lose transactions. We've never lost one yet. We know what comes in, we know what goes out, and they balance in the middle. It's also got to be fast, hence the vital graphic of the clock and the calendar, because we have significant and very binding service level agreements on delivery, and at Christmas volumes can double. Typically the last Saturday before Christmas is our busiest day, and we'll have anything up to twice the normal volume of transactions. It's not quite as big a peak because people are shopping online more, but certainly when I started, the last week before Christmas was just a huge mountain in our flows. So we need to clear it, and clearing is where we actually update financial records. The authorization record is fine, but members update their banks, their book balances and so on the clearing record. Another thing of course, it's very important, is where we convert transactions to the cardholder's currency. If you happen to have been shopping in Papua New Guinea with your UK card, the shopkeeper doesn't want sterling, and you certainly don't have Papua New Guinea dollars, I think it is, as the currency to pay your card bill. So clearing is where we sort out all the currency conversions that need to happen. And we also validate transactions in clearing to check for broken rules. Has somebody sent in rubbish? Doesn't happen very often. We get a few a day where the acquirer software systems haven't quite got something right, and we'll send it back. I do apologise, sorry, I've used a piece of jargon. If I was giving this presentation at work, there'd be a charity box with a pile of pound coins, because I've used a term which I haven't explained. So I'll metaphorically put a pound in the box. The acquirer is the shop's bank. So every shop, every merchant has a bank who takes transactions from the shop and passes it on to Visa. I do apologise for that. What happens when there's a dispute? You've ordered. What happens now? In clearing, we also deal with disputed transactions. The vast bulk of our transactions go through, no problem, whoosh. But what happens if you don't recognise a transaction on your card statement? We also deal with that here. And I would advise you, however dull it is, to read your card statements. It's a very strong line of defence against fraud or somebody misusing your card. So if you suddenly see a transaction you don't recognise, call your bank and ask them to look into it, and you should get a full refund on it. There are some rules on when cardholders can ask for refunds. Clearly, if I buy a coffee at I don't buy coffee at Starbucks, but I buy coffee at a major chain, and I don't like it, and I've used my Visa card, it's unreasonable to ask for my £2.50 back for the coffee. So there's certain rules around these things, and we spend a lot of time on our systems looking for disputes. Settlement is when the money actually moves. Again, going back to the banking analogy, thinking now of coffee houses from the 18th century, where somebody had the bright idea, if at the end of the day, if you've got two banks, what you don't do is say, well, you owe me £100 and I owe you £80. You only pass the difference between you. And that's just what Visa does. We total up all the transactions in all the different currencies, calculate what each member is owed or owes into the system. We provide lots of reporting. I think in a typical day we'll generate 100,000 pages of reports to members. The 3,500 members we have around Europe, hopefully. Occasionally you wonder. And we then support the movement of funds. And we move funds very quickly. We've got euros up there. If European members settle in euros, they settle the same day. We finish processing early hours of the morning. We give the positions, and by the end of the normal business day in Europe, all the money's moved. It happens that quickly. There are merchants to pay. There are banks to settle with. We move very quickly. The money moves quickly. Again, accurate. It needs to balance to zero. We had a very small defect, which I won't go into now, but it took about 3 months to work out that it was actually a rounding error, a rounding thing inside our system coinciding with a particular value of transaction. And that took about 3 months to finally wheedle out of our systems and work out what's going wrong. And again, we need to be fast. It doesn't matter how many transactions come in, settlement is going to happen at this time every day. We have to be ready. Everything happens to a fixed schedule. Members have to be ready, they have to have money ready. The money ready to settle. If they owe money into the system, they've got to have liquid funds available and need to know how much. So we have to be ready for them. And settlement is probably the least regarded part of the whole of card processing, but without it, it won't work. These are banks, we need to move money and help them out. As you can imagine, we've got a lot of data at Visa, and we run a data warehouse to start looking for things like data quality. Are we getting good quality transactions, good quality data from members? Are we doing the right thing? And also looking for fraudulent patterns of transactions. We know what a transaction normally looks like, and we'll run analytics to go looking for fraud. There's one service which can go and look, one system we can run to go and look at fraudulent transactions we know are fraudulent because our issuers have told us so, and see if there's one particular merchant that all of these cards visited. Because then it's there, chances are it's that merchant that compromised the cards. That's not cast iron, it could be accidental. But it's the kind of analysis we can do. We also look at transaction volumes, money, what's happening. We have, our data warehouse has around 40 terabytes of data in it. And there's also, we have an option of, under very strict controls, under information security, then you can run queries on data to say, tell me how many ATM transactions in this country, or that kind of very general data. We can't, by the way, I certainly can't, and I don't know anybody who can look at individual transactions just through our warehouse. Oh, there we go. Again, this is the professional meetings. So one of the biggest challenges we have on our data warehouse is making data consistent in meaning. Because there's so much variety, because we have so many transactions, it's how do you define what is a POS transaction, what is a sales transaction against a cash disbursement transaction. So if one of our marketing people says, can you tell me how many POS transactions happened in Latvia yesterday? Then there are very strict definitions about what all of that means. What do we mean? Yeah, obviously, what do we mean by Latvia? Well, we know what Latvia is a country. What is a POS transaction? How is that represented in our transaction data? And that's under particular governance. I'm one of the data governance team, as well as my day job, and we discuss and define what does a transaction look like. And so if you have a large data warehouse, it's that kind of thing that I would suggest is usually your challenge. So that's really what Visa Europe does. How am I doing on time? Okay. Again, this is a professional meeting, so rather than just go, rah, rah, aren't we good at what we do? So what are our challenges? Technology, including the ones used to record presentations, is constantly changing. And there's an insatiable appetite for new ways to pay. Contactless cards, I helped introduce them about 5 years ago. And it's taken a little while to get some traction, but there's now a very strong market of these. And it's about speed. It's about, I want to buy a coffee, a sandwich, newspaper, but I don't want to put a card into a slot, put in a pin, and then take it out again. Touch it on the terminal, and it's done. All of this affects, and we need to make changes inside our core platform, our changes to make it all work. Secure online payments. We've all talked about Verify by Visa, which is quite, I wouldn't say it's long on the tooth. It's now thoroughly in use. There's a thing called prepaid cards, which is like you put money onto a card, then you can spend it. So it's like a gift card that you use. And all of these require changes. And how do we manage that? The answer is with difficulty. It is not because our systems are very tightly integrated into our members. I talked earlier on about the flat file format for our clearing transactions. Well, if we add anything to that, we need to tell, in theory, every member in the world, all 24,000 of them, 6 months in advance, so they can update their own systems to be ready. That's quite a communications challenge. And we run workshops, we have formal technical communications, and it takes a great deal of effort. Again, we also, our operational changes, swapping out routers, sorting out servers, all of that, everything is recorded and controlled. We have very strict change control. Even somebody walking into the data hall at one of our processing centres, that's a change we record and we manage. So they're allowed in for 2 hours, they're allowed out again. When we're finished, it's cleared, they're no longer in there, and we know exactly the state of our systems. Mostly once a year around Christmas, we also limit any change that can be made. That's not to say we don't make changes at Christmas at all, but we make a few, but it's got to be essential and it's got to be very carefully planned. This contrasts with, this conflicts with countries moving to the euro, which almost universally want to change to the euro at midnight on January the 1st, which is still in our control period. So we do a lot of planning, a lot of preparation. When Estonia moved a couple of years ago, I was was the lead of the team that moved to Estonia. And if you want exciting business acceptance testing, it's watching the president of Estonia use an ETM with a Visa card at 5 minutes past midnight. And you're thinking, if that doesn't work, we are in a world of trouble right now. Yeah. It worked. It worked. It worked and it was fine. We knew it would be fine, but it's just that skip of the beat. So if you think you have trouble in business acceptance testing, come and join us. ITIL is used as the starting point for service management. That's the Bible by which our operations and service management runs. Functional changes, we have a detailed and traceable development life cycle. Whilst we do build large new systems, there's a new platform called v.me, which is about online payments. It's about the changes within live systems. How do we, so we want to change how our authorization switch functions. There's a very, very detailed development life cycle. In fact, it's not an old development life cycle. We had like 300 odd individual steps and to deliver a change, one of which was to develop the code. Think about that. A lot of it was about project management, testing, deployment, monitoring. How do we get it in? We're aiming for CMM level 3. I'm not sure if we've been certified yet, but we're aiming for CMM level 3. I think we're there in practice, but we've yet to be formally certified. And given that less than 10 years ago, Visa Europe didn't develop anything, not even its own web pages, that's a fair achievement to go from scratch to CMM level 3. I talked about availability earlier on, that availability was important to us. You often hear about 5 nines, saying, we're 5 nines, you can achieve 5 nines. That's not enough. It would mean we'd miss several thousand transactions per day. We had one outage in all the time I've been at Visa Europe. It was about 90 minutes, and it made it onto the front page of BBC News Online. So again, it's very public if it goes wrong. And just to show the sensitivity, I was preparing my children's tea one Saturday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, listening to the day listening to PM. And it's like, second headline is, shops all over the country can't accept Visa cards. And I just dropped my spoon and ran for my corporate BlackBerry to find out what was going on. It wasn't us, it was one of our acquirers. But I wasn't even on call, but it's just that, it's the Pavlovian thing, it's not working. Let's go. Is it us? Is it something we need to do? How do we do it? Multiple data centers, of course. And they're physically some way apart. In our disaster planning, I once joked in a meeting about a helicopter dropping on one of our data centers. I'm told that's not a joke. Don't even think about it. Despite not apart from killing off all the people on the bridge. It would be, it would take us down for several months. It would take us down for several months, except we have multiple data centers and we can switch between them. We can manage, our applications. Everything is resilient and can run on multiple sites. From day one, we architect it that way. It's not even an add-on later. It's architected to run on separate sites. We do a lot of performance testing before releases. I talked earlier on about how quickly, reliably we had to work, and we really do. We just to check that nothing has changed. We do regression testing, aggressive regression testing as well. Is everything going to be okay when it goes live? So in fact, when we do major releases twice a year, we release them to members, the command centers, and the people on the phones. It should all be very quiet, and it usually is. It's working. We don't have to worry. We have a lot of extensive monitoring and reporting of operating level and service level agreements. and understand the root causes of problems. And again, that's one lesson that I would say. It's not just enough to say we had a problem, or we fixed it. We had a problem, we fixed it. Now what was really wrong? Can we dig down and understand it and really fix it? And again, we've been 100% processing available since May 2007. At least it was until I did pick up the last operations report before I came in to the building. So unless something's gone badly wrong the last hour, about 2 hours, we're still fine. Fraud prevention, clearly when you have hundreds of millions of euros a day flowing through a system, somebody is going to try and defraud cards. And things only work if everybody trusts each other. So we deploy techniques to identify who we're using the card. I talked about that earlier on. PINs, address validation, verified by Visa. We look at transactions. And also, we deploy the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. At one level, it's actually quite simple. It's telling small merchants, if you have a PC, if nobody uses it for 10 minutes, make sure it locks itself. If you have card data on a PC, it must lock itself. Now, of course, you and I know that, but people running a small shop in the Midwest of the United States probably don't. But it also goes up to big merchants, keeping things encrypted, keeping things secure. There are card processors in the world who've not met that standard, and we've told banks that process through them to stop using them. It's only happened a couple of times, I think, but both company processors went out of business pretty quickly. Security is all. Last but one slide, we're glad to hear. Our next generation. We have an IT apprentice scheme. This is something I've been involved with particularly. We've recruited 29 apprentices, and they're all staggeringly bright. I feel so old. They're 18, 19, 20, and I just feel so old when they're talking together. They spend the first 2 years, they visit operations, customer support, development, that's requirement and development, actually co-development, and also testing. Testing is important at Visa. So they spend 6 months doing testing of some form. And the reason they go around all the areas is that particularly graduates come in, they like development, that looks fun. Operations, what's operations? Sitting in a room with a lot of computers. Actually, it's fascinating. Keeping these systems up, running, is an intriguing and a very rewarding career. And so we're just exposing these young people to every aspect of what we do. They complete a quite high apprentice qualification, and they also study for a foundation degree whilst they're with us as well. They're very, very busy. I think regularly it's a 6-day week for them. But that's something we're particularly proud of. We'll be recruiting more again this year and feeding them out through the business. And so if you are a reasonable sized company, I would urge you to think about this and do it well, because it's revelatory. It's quite extraordinary. I also discovered that you can upgrade the firmware in a digital camera. I was talking to my apprentice casually, and he said, "Oh, they've just done a firmware upgrade for that." What? I had just no idea you upgraded cameras, the software inside cameras. So, we don't have sound, so I'm going to turn the sound on the PC up very high. Let's see if we can help. What this video is the one we share with our member banks to talk about our processing. So it is a bit of an advertising video, but it summarises pretty much everything I've said up to now. So here we go.
To be fast. Almost 500 million euros has been invested
Thank you very much.
Oh, no, don't get that.
Yeah, so, thank you.
In the video, the first video, there was a guy, he was pressing the card, like punching numbers in the card at the back of the card. What was that?
Right, that's a very interesting question. There is a card product out there where you remember we talked about Verify by Visa and the screen pops up. What it does is it gives you a number, you type that number in, and then it displays a response. So you type the response in, and then the bank matches the two, and then approves the transaction. That's quite new. Those cards are quite expensive to make, which is why they've not really hit the marketplace yet, but they're coming in. That's something we developed a couple of years ago.
You have to take the card out of the ATM.
It's just for online purchases, so it's where you've got the card in front of you, and it'll do it for you. And it's there's a second computer because of the EMV chip. There's like a microcontroller itself, but there's a small computer in there which does call and response. Yes, sorry.
What percentage of your transactions are still done on the old swiper piece of paper?
Do you know, that's a fascinating question. I don't know. Very, very, very few. We don't record when something's done on paper. We just don't know how it was done because it's not electronic. We don't know. I think the last one I had was when I went to Estonia, and that was the taxi that took me to Stansted Airport. And he had one of these zip-zap machines in the back. Not only that, when I got to Estonia, I had Estonian currency on me. I think, well, I need to get to the hotel. He had an EMV, the Estonian taxi driver had an EMV car terminal in his car, which is just dazzling. It's quite a contrast. I'm sorry, yes?
I was wondering, you said your transactions are all under 200 milliseconds. At what rate? I mean, how many thousands of transactions a minute?
The question is, how many transactions per second do we process? At Christmas peak, we were nearly 1,500 transactions per second. That was averaged out over a 5-minute period. So, and of course, that's asynchronous. We don't control, this is not batched in. We just get them when we get them and process them in real time. I think there's a gentleman there.
Yes, you mentioned about security. One of the concerns these days is hackers visiting websites and downloading entire databases of people's card data. I was just wondering if there's any sort of responses that you're able to do yourselves as a company to that kind of attacking of people's card data.
The question is there any response that Visa can take if an entire cardholder database is downloaded? We can block transaction cards very quickly, and we can do it in bulk. Of course, it depends when they find out. Some of these, some attacks. It tends not to be banks. Banks tend to be fairly organised. I think the worst example was at a TK Maxx somewhere in the East Coast, and they were doing that by hacking into the wireless network of the shop. Yes, we can block cards very quickly. If we know the cards that have gone, then we can load them into our services. I think I talked earlier on about checking for lost and stolen cards, and we can load that database in bulk very quickly. So yes.
I'm just intrigued by the CB2 number. It's a secret you have to tell everyone you transact business with. And I'm wondering whether there is any move in the pipeline to do something a bit more robust than that, because it inevitably, over a period of time, if you're busy online, you'll be spreading that secret credential very widely.
I think the answer is, well, there's two answers to that. One is that's now considered quite a little bit old-fashioned, and it's not. So it's not particularly. It's not what we call like a strong authentication. It's better than nothing, which is why you see it everywhere. Really, the key is when you're using a website. If you're not sure about a website, and I'm sure I don't have to tell the audience in here. If you're not sure about a website, don't. Look to make sure it's SSL encrypted as well. And that's, but in the end, instincts tell you, does this look wrong? So it's not a strong one. Verified by Visa, on the other hand, is very strong because the website has to authenticate.
Cambridge Computer Lab published a paper about 3 years ago, which displayed 3 excellent spoof verified by Visa interfaces which are put up by man-in-the-middle attacks off websites that have been compromised. And I'm wondering if there's any future move against that as well. But we're talking here not about the integrity of the site you're going to as being a fraudulent site, but the integrity of the site you're going to as being the one you really think you're talking to.
Right.
It encrypts the data in transit
Yeah.
to the wrong people.
The answer is, do you mind if I don't answer that? And it's not because we don't have an answer, it's because it goes to the root of how 3D Secure works.
Fair enough.
I do apologise for that. I know, but yeah, there are ways around it. Sorry, yes.
There were recently some very public and long-lasting operational problems in that with bank and World Bank.
Mm-hmm.
What impact did they have on VT?
Again, I don't want to comment on particular banks, if you don't mind, because they are members of ours. For banks like that, what we can do is the stand-in processing. We talked earlier on about if a bank's not available, we can stand in for them. Well, when banks are having very severe troubles like that, we will actually stand in for them for everything. So they just sign off our systems and we look after what we're doing for them. And we just protect them from those transactions. They've got almost time to think. So they connect.
So hypothetical intelligence, standing in for them for a few seconds, a few minutes, an hour, you can stand in for them for sort of 2 months.
As long, hopefully not 2 months, but we can stand in for banks as long as necessary. It was actually during the early 90s, after the Berlin Wall had come down. It was actually quite common. It was quite common until they were asked not to, for banks in what was Eastern Europe to sign off their systems at a weekend and then come back on Monday morning and switch them on again. So nobody had to work over the weekend. Just waited for Visa to stand in. They were discouraged from that kind of practice. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, just to follow up on the question. When you're standing in for a bank, do you have access to the customer's accounts? Because how do you verify they got the funds?
We have certain. Sorry, the question is, how do we verify card accounts? We have certain. Each member gives us rules about how to approve or not approve a transaction, and then we follow those. So it is possible that somebody could go overdrawn, but then there are certain cards, such as ones given to under 18-year-olds in the UK, where they're not allowed to overdraw, and they might get. We can just say, if I get a card of the transaction with a card like this, just decline it, because we can't verify they've got funds. Occasionally, you might see on like petrol pubs and so on, we don't accept the old Solo card or Visa Electron. So Solo was the old Switch brand, or Visa Electron. That's because they're always authorised. Every transaction, no matter how large or small, is authorised by the issuer. And it's those that you give to under 18s who aren't allowed to incur debt, because you can then say, you definitely can't afford this. Right. So, just jump in here.
This may be one that you don't want to answer or can't answer, but if I use the word MasterCard, I mean, obviously they have a network. Now, I just wondered what the relationship was, whether they're seen as something separate or whether there's some interoperability, because presumably the banks have to support, or some banks must support both systems.
Okay, commercially they're a competitor. But then we have other competitors around the world, such as JCB in Japan or UnionPay in China, and other schemes around the world. So it's another competitor. We do, in fact, process MasterCard transactions on occasions. There is a service where a bank can connect to Visa and send us MasterCard and Visa transactions. And if we see a MasterCard transaction, we send it to MasterCard. So, to that extent, we do, there is an element of cooperation. And it's also a recognition that we both have the same impacts to banks. So, for example, EMV was actually Europay, MasterCard, Visa. and it was a joint company set up to develop one chip standard for the world, because it made no sense to have three, and they'd have to have three terminals on a desk, and then other card schemes joined in, like American Express and so on, and they've put these chips on their cards. So at an industry level, we sort of there are moments where it's sensible to cooperate. I mentioned earlier on we do twice yearly changes. Well, MasterCard do their changes on the same day, so the banks only have to do one development cycle for all their systems rather than two. But otherwise, so there is a small element of practical cooperation, but it's usually at the behest of the banks, saying, right, can you cooperate on this? Can we do some technical cooperation? I'm sorry, sorry, gentleman right at the back.
You depend to some extent on spending patterns for fraud detection, but yet people are encouraged to have multiple cards or swap cards as different offers come in. Do you, as the organisation that knows about individuals, track card use of multiple cards from different banks?
No. We can't, no, we know the PAN, which is the 16-digit number on the front. That's all we know. So we don't know who, so if we see a PAN, we can't link it to an individual. So I can't, so if we don't hold that, that's the issuers, that's absolutely down to the issuers. We hold no personal information at that level. So yes, we can follow what a particular PAN does, and we can block a PAN, but we can't, if somebody's got 5 cards, we can't link them together.
I think that would work to the benefit perhaps of the user, because they would establish a better credit record pattern since you only keep it for 2 years. You can't transfer it from card to card.
That's a good question. I can't answer it. I don't know is the answer. So rather than I can't answer it, it's just I can't answer it because I don't know. So, gentleman at the back.
When a merchant, suppose you phone up a merchant and do a telephone transaction, they take your name and they take your address for obvious reasons. Presumably that is transmitted via you to the final bank, but you don't retain it, is that correct?
That's correct,
Right,
yeah.
so you don't see it, you simply act as a conduit for it.
Yes, when we talk about address validation, we don't actually try and match an address. There's a cryptogram that's generated. So you can't unscramble it halfway through and say, that's 38 Browning Drive, Hitchin. It's just the number that we transmit around our systems. Yes, gentleman in the orange jacket.
Prepaid cards.
Yes.
How on earth do you get them? Post office.
Post office, well, they do MasterCard, so I can't say that. But they do them, yeah. Prepaid, that's actually a good question. They're not as big in the UK as they might be. They're sometimes.
From different countries. I mean, it's probably essential.
It is.
I've got one in euros, which is Visa.
Yes,
And in sterling, it's also Visa that I use elsewhere.
yeah. You can buy them at Bureau de Change. Bureau de Change, I call them sometimes call them currency cards. But to be honest, I've never had one. So I was given one as a present from work, but I've never actually bought one, so I couldn't tell you, I'm afraid. we celebrated our 50 years of the beginning of Visa, and we were given €50 on a prepaid card, which is nice, just as a thank you, as a special card.
Prepaid cards to Newcastle buildings are you using the charities? I don't know whether they do those for individuals.
Yeah.
Like your credit balance can expire and they take certificate charges after a certain period and so on. That's no money good.
Okay. Sorry. Who hasn't? Yes, sorry. Yes, you. Sorry.
Quite a light-hearted one. The contactless payment that you swipe the thing in
Mhm.
McDonald's and pay. What's to stop someone in the London Underground having a device in his briefcase that skims me every time the train jostles? Is the only solution a tinfoil wallet?
The question is, if you have a contactless card, do you need a tinfoil wallet to prevent it? I've sort of managed that myself, because I've actually got 2 contactless cards in my wallet together, and the readers won't read them, because it gets confused. So
Does it
actually,
charge you twice for the
no.
Big Mac?
Well, I can't speak for McDonald's, but I do know the coffee bar at work has contactless for obvious reasons, because we're testing the technology. These things work at a very, very short, very, very close distance. I mean, in fact, this card is actually in this wallet, part of my wallet, because it's just close enough. It's just close enough to actually work. So when I only had one contactless card, I could just put my wallet against the reader and it would work. Now there's two, it doesn't quite work the same way.
Sign up to the library, it won't work at all. 'Cause you've got an extra card in the way.
It doesn't like it. It is very, very close. I mean, because you see security cards around buildings where people like wave them vaguely at a reader. No, it doesn't work like it's very short range indeed. I mean, I was actually just push it up against the terminal to make it work.
So contactless is a bit of a misnomer.
It's contactless in the sense you're not reading the chip directly. You're reading it by radio. Yeah, but you sort of try. You see people trying to wave it near the terminal, doesn't quite. Yeah, it's actually best. There was an illustration of contactless earlier on. Actually, you just push it on, but it reads in about half a second. So it's pretty quick. Okay. Sorry, I think this gentleman's been quite patient. So.
There are obviously your Visa Europe, and there's obviously other
Mm-hmm.
things around the world. So if I go to the States and pay there, the merchant's acquirer is obviously going to be probably going to be an American bank.
Mm-hmm.
How does that transaction get to my bank in the UK? Is it mostly processed in the States, or mostly processed? Which end does it go to get bulk of its processing?
Yes, just the question is, if you use a card outside of Europe, how does it get processed? The answer is it'll be picked up by the acquirer in the United States, sent to our sister company Visa Inc., which takes one look at it, says, this is for Europe, and sends it to us.
Right,
It does some basic validation, says it's a reasonable transaction, it's bound for Europe, and it'll send it to us, and then we route it between our two systems. Just to give a little background on that, in Europe, the European members didn't want, about 5 years ago, when Visa Inc. became a publicly listed company, European members didn't want to become a company, they wanted to stay as they were. So we separate, so the two companies are separate but under one brand. So we have separate processing which we tie together.
That presumably also helps with data protection, because it means your data doesn't flow outside of Europe unless it has to.
And that's an interesting question. The answer is yes, you're right. It doesn't leave Europe unless it needs to. And there are countries, and Russia is one, that doesn't like Visa because data leaves the country. They want it. They say, well, if it's a Russian issuer and a Russian acquirer, it must stay in Russia. And the answer was, well, that's fine, but your processing's off here somewhere. And there are one or two countries that just don't like Visa domestically. We don't process every Visa transaction. I mean, there are a couple of countries in Europe where the banks process it themselves, and we only see the ones that are crossing borders. Obviously, we'd like to process them all because we'd see all the data and we can do more, but that's our members decide what they want to do. So, this gentleman here.
If you make a change to your system that requires corresponding changes from your member banks,
Mm-hmm.
do you have to wait until they're all up to the same level, or can you process both the old and new depending on who's upgraded and who's not?
Depends on the change. If it's an entirely new service, then quite often the way we'll do it is what we call a soft launch, which is where we'll say to members, if you're interested, sign up for it and you can join in. There are occasionally changes that we have to make for legal reasons, and everybody switches together. And so the way we manage that is that we communicate the change. We communicate the change in good time, but we also run member test systems to allow members to try out their own changes against our systems to see that everything's gone right. Now, if it's a really important change, they have to test, and we actually keep a record of who's tested and who's passed correctly. So when we go live, everyone's ready. Of course, there's always the odd miscreant or somebody who didn't test properly or something's gone wrong, and that's an operational matter then to deal with them and help them over their problems. When you've got 3,500 banks, there's always one, isn't there? It's going to have got it wrong or something, and it just happens. It just happens that way.
Do you define the tests that the banks have to meet?
Yes, we define the tests, generate the test data, and we send them the test data. Either we send them the test cases that they need to do, and they generate the transactions and send them to us. There's a whole group of people who do nothing all day but member testing, and we have copies of production available constantly. It's a major change, and it's one of our biggest challenges is how do you manage change across all of these banks at once when in theory our changes go in over a period of a couple of seconds. We actually define in authorizations, we define the change as happening on this date at 1100.0001 GMT. And so you can imagine that's the tense moment. Yes, sorry.
You mentioned that there are a lot of different ways to pay and new ones are coming on all the time. I was interested in the sort of creative processes of how these things are thought up. I mean, do you sort of have committees that try and predict where are things going and what are people likely to be wanting to do in the future? And
I think
I was just wondering how that sort of works.
Like big organisations, we have a strategy. There's a lot of people who sit in Ivory House called strategy. Sorry, just repeat the question. I've forgotten. The question is, how do we think of new products?
Well, or think of new ways, like the idea of contactless payment. Everybody was happy typing and everything, but obviously somebody had the idea. Why not just do that? So I was just interested more as to how they move from somebody's light bulb to actually getting sort of implemented. Really.
Ideas can come from several places. Sometimes the banks themselves will approach us and say, we have this problem, can you help? Sometimes we see the market changing. So people in strategy, people in marketing look at how is the world changing. And for instance, contactless is a very good example because we could see that we got lots of transactions roughly above £10, but we knew there were vast bulk of transactions in the world are below £10. It is, the sandwich, the newspaper and so on, all those low value purchases. And then it's understanding, well, why is that happening? And then what can we put in place to make it work? And that what can we put in place to make it work? And then the technology follows. Ideally, we like to think of a service. What is it we're going to offer? Then the technology follows. And sometimes we'll have an idea of a service, and there's no way we can make it work technically. We have to stop. And it's okay, great idea, but it's not technically feasible. And then other times that's a great idea. We'll try it out on people, and yes, that's great, and we'll go and build it. Such as V.me, which is the online payment service that we've launched recently. I think possibly one or two more.
Just leading on, Oyster.
Yes.
Threat, opportunity, takeover target.
Oh, you'd have to ask the business people that. In as much as you can now do a contactless transaction on a bus instead of an Oyster card. I suppose opportunity, but that's something you'd have to ask. Interestingly, this contactless card, I keep pulling this out. I'm going to have to cover the number up again. This is actually both a contactless card and an Oyster card. So it's actually got the chip for Oyster. I've never used it as a Oyster card, but that's because I obviously have a season ticket, so I'm a daily commuter to London. But they can coexist, or one can replace the other. But lady at the back.
You were talking about your apprenticeship scheme.
Mm-hmm.
They go through the different routes. You put them into development last. so they've seen the problems that they could possibly create.
I've been asked about the apprentice scheme. Do we put them into development last to see the problems that they can generate? No. Just because of the amount of attention that they need. I mean, when as a senior member of staff, I had one apprentice to look after and bring on and so on. They tend to get split up. They get split up amongst the 4 streams in order. I think they learn very, very quickly. They learn very, very quickly that, you know, if they've been in operations, if they've been in testing, the problems that they can come in development. And my second apprentice had spent 6 months in an operational acceptance test area. And so he came in very aware of how important it is to get requirements right and do your development properly. So, you know, they're pretty well drilled. I mean, again, it's a good thing about the apprenticeship is we can give them the time and give them the exposure. And it's been quite a remarkable thing. It's taken 3 years to get off the ground to where it is, but it's a pretty remarkable thing. So, gentlemen, perhaps last question there, because I know we're coming near time.
It said that in 2008 that the world's banking system was on the point of being sort of shut down. So were you then effectively about to sort of shut yourself off? Or, how was Visa affected by the suspect that the whole banking system might have to close down?
The issue would have been if a bank couldn't settle. If a bank actually simply went out of existence, went bankrupt, none of them did, by the way, we were fine. If a bank went out of existence, one of our issuers went out of existence, Visa would have had to have stepped in to cover their balances for the day, their balance for the day. So one of the promises of Visa is we will always pay the acquirer. So if a bank goes out of business or something wrong, we cover them. And that need not be sinister as a major financial collapse. It could be again, somebody cutting the fibre optic to the offices where they do their banking, and they're just about to send us the money and everything stops working. What do you do? Well, we stand in for them. We stand in and we cover them. But that would have been about being the extent of it. And there was last question here.
Yeah, small question. The one about the slide you had about ITIL change. You mentioned that when people enter a data center room, that their entrance is logged, and when they leave, it's also logged. The whole question of asset management of your assets in the data center. How on earth do you record that? How much of it is automated?
It's not automated. It's somebody in the operation. Well, somebody going into the data hall. Apart from being accompanied, of course. Yeah, I presume somebody raises a change record to say we have an IBM engineer in the data hall and filling in the details, and then when they leave, that ticket's closed.
That must be massive.
Yes. But it keeps the lights on. Yeah, I mean, yeah. You know, we live in fear of actually stuff's not working. That's what keeps us awake at night. Well, and stops me cooking my children's tea at 5 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. Is the even possibility that something stopped working? It's, you know, that's, yeah, and that's why we do what we do, and why payments as an area is so challenging, so interesting. Is how do you do things which seem almost science fiction at times? How do you keep it on? How do you authenticate? How do you do this? And you just have to be very, very good at everything all the time and not let up and get better, because the more you do and the better you get, the less likely you are to have a problem.
Yeah, I don't doubt that.
Yeah.
Must be 60% of the company.
Enough, yeah. I mean, we're a technology company, so good large slice of us are scientists and engineers and technologists.
Thank you. No doubt you'll stay with us.
Yes.
10 or 15 minutes.
Yes, certainly.
If there is any further burning questions, we can have you or an orange juice or a cup of coffee. Brilliant, Lewis. Thank you very much.